So it's in my role as a board member for CAHA that I'm here today to report back on some events that Lynn, my wife, and I attended in late August, early September. First of all, the WHO's Climate and Health Conference in Geneva, and then events around Climate Week and the UN Climate Summit in New York about 2 weeks later. And I was there representing CAHA, and at the UN Climate Summit there was also Liz Hanna, the president of CAHA, so we were well represented at these events. So first of all, the WHO Climate and Health meeting in Geneva. This was remarkably, in 2014, the first meeting that WHO had held on climate and health. Remarkable. And the intention was to inform the next phase of WHO's climate and health work plan, and also to help member nations, member states to the WHO, influence their own countries' climate policies and so on. And so it was initially thought they might get a couple of hundred people there. They ended up with about 400. There were about 40 health ministers, mainly from Europe or small island states, who are particularly affected, as you know, by climate change. But the only representative from the Australian government was a very pleasant woman. I went and spoke to her, but she worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She was part of the permanent delegation from Australia to the WHO in Geneva. She knew nothing about the issues whatsoever, and at any of the meetings I went to during those 3 days, she never spoke. Now, this is no criticism of her. As I say, she was a very pleasant and intelligent person, but she was there but knowing nothing basically about the issues. So that's by way of comment on Australia's commitment to the meeting. And they were very proud of the fact that WHO, it was a green meeting. They'd sort of offset everybody's airfares, with carbon offsets and so on, and they didn't have any papers. It was everyone was given a stick with all the memory on, and the food was locally produced, sustainable food. So it was a really interesting 3 days. Firstly, it was stated clearly, and no one disagreed, that we're not going to talk about the evidence here. The evidence is clear. Climate change is occurring. It's anthropogenic. It's on this sort of trajectory of disaster, and there are major health consequences and threats to humanity. And that business as usual will just precipitate that disaster. So that wasn't debated whatsoever. That was stated clearly in the first sort of half a day, and the only comment people made after that was to agree with it. One of the things that did emerge was this very clear commitment, though, that whilst we all know that the health effects of climate change are already there to be seen, not just in developing nations or low-lying countries, but also in countries like Australia. They're already there. They're going to get worse. And that they are, for individuals in the community, perhaps powerful motivators for them to get involved in advocacy and action around climate change, that the health body internationally has really not made much of this. That there really isn't much perception either in the corridors of power or industry or in the general population, even amongst our colleagues in health, those of us who work in health, that this is a major issue for health, the health of the people, not just for whales and butterflies and forests. Okay, and that there's a real need here to get this message out, and that was very strong. That very strongly came through. And again, you'll know a lot of this, but there are immense co-benefits here. That this is not necessarily a large expense. That in many cases, action to reduce climate change will save money and will have health benefits for individuals and communities, and that there's immense potential there in community at large to realise these core benefits, but also within the health system itself, which again, as you know, has a massive environmental footprint and is a very large emitter of greenhouse gases from work done in America and the United Kingdom, I'm not aware of any work here, the health system probably contributes somewhere in the region of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% of greenhouse gases nationally. So that the health system has an immense role to play in reducing its own emissions, setting an example and being a strong advocate. So that came through at the meeting. There was lots and lots of good information presented from a whole range of different perspectives. Links to air pollution very strongly made as well. So these short-term air pollutants that emerge from the burning of fossil fuels in particular. And there was lots of enthusiasm and commitment for action. But some disappointments. I think within the health body generally, this is just a reflection on the meeting, I'm not sure that we are clear about what our response should be, a sort of a clear model of action for health services and health professionals. What are our responsibilities? What might we be able to achieve? What should we be doing to achieve these things? I think there's work still to be done. There's people have written about these things, but I don't think there's a generally accepted view of what we really should be doing and how we can do it. And then the major disappointments were that despite the group that we were associated with, the Global Climate and Health Alliance and a few others, arguing strongly and repeatedly that this is just not like any other previous problem facing the world, whether it be smallpox or inequalities or poverty or starvation, that this is not something that could perhaps be delayed action for 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 years, because they might be major issues, but they're not going to destroy the environment and humanity. That this is a really urgent issue. The meeting as a whole, the WHO was reluctant to take on board in any official statement or any official position that this is really, really urgent. There wasn't really an acceptance of the ecosystems and ecological, social ecological health perspective, that it's not just a threat to individual species, but the real threat to humanity and the environment at large is the destruction that will occur to ecosystems, that there was a failure to really recognise that, and complex adaptive systems approaches. And similarly, a complete running away from this tackling of the fossil fuel industry issues. They really didn't want to put that in any statements or any comments or whatever. So the big issues of urgency and ecosystems and fossil fuels very much suppressed. Didn't come out in the final statement from the conference, did come out in a statement from the Global Climate and Health Alliance and others. But in that regard, quite disappointing. But I suppose it was enthusiasm, and it was the first meeting. There were a lot of people there. So that was that first meeting in Geneva. The pictures you're seeing, the holiday snaps, of course, are Lynn and me in the UN General Assembly. That's the very end of what I'm going to say. But the rest are mainly of the climate march, so they're just by way of background. I'll keep going. So after that, we went to New York, and as well as Liz Hanna in New York, another colleague that many of you will know, Tony Capon, was there as well. And it was around Climate Week. And Climate Week's been going for a few years in New York, 6 or 7 as I recall, and it's organised in during the 2-week period that the General Assembly of the United Nations meets in New York in early mid-September. But this is the first year it's really taken off. So the Climate Week started with the People's March that I'm sure you're all aware of. There were marches or events here in Sydney, which I understand were very low key, much more prominent in Melbourne, as I understand it. But the Climate March occurred on the Sunday at the beginning of this thing called Climate Week, during which there's just loads and loads of events. You just can't go to everything. You can't go to anywhere near everything. There's so much going on. And the organisers really were very nervous. Although they wanted to organise a People's March, they were worried about 2 levels. Firstly, there might be violence, and that would really set things back. They were really worried there might be violence, like Occupy and that sort of thing. And they were worried that they wouldn't get anyone. That they'd organise this big march with lots of sort of hoo-ha, and 50,000 people would turn up. It'd be a flop. And so they were really reluctant to commit to numbers. They hoped they'd get 100,000. And on the basis of that, the police sort of then organised. They wouldn't let them congregate in Central Park. They wouldn't let them finish at a proper location. So in effect, it just congregated up the west side of Central Park, and it marched through the streets and finished just at the street corner because they didn't think they'd get the numbers. As you now know, depending on estimates, probably 350 to 400,000 people turned up. It was a phenomenal day. There was just so much action and goodwill, and the police were phenomenal. They were so benign, and they just helped things along. There was no trouble, there was no violence. It was just goodwill. There were children and all sorts of things. It was a tremendous event. But the importance of the event really was that in the events that Lynn and I went to in the week following that, during Climate Week, and heard people like Ban Ki-moon speak, and John Kerry, and Tutu on video, and all sorts of people, Bloomberg, all sorts of people who spoke, prominent people, kept saying, wasn't the march fantastic? I was in the march, to which people got great applause, and the march was a game changer. This is what people like John Kerry were saying, and Ban Ki-moon and others, that getting so many people out on the streets, not just in New York but elsewhere, this was a message that government and UN and people like that really got. And I can't tell you how important that was. So, you know, another week, another march, there's hardly a weekend goes by I don't demonstrate about something. And you think, oh, well, what the hell? But it really can have an effect. And it can change people's expectations and people's behaviours. During Climate Week, there were a whole load of events. There was a big launch at which Ban Ki-moon and John Kerry spoke. I didn't go to that, Lynn did. I went to a health day that the Global Climate and Health Alliance organised, which was again interesting, but again a bit low-key in terms of the real challenges. Lots of useful information. The US Surgeon General came. You know, it's a pretty high level of all this stuff, but still a bit disappointing in outcomes. There were lots of meetings of charitable, organised by the philanthropic sector, which is very strong in America. Trevor was saying about the announcement by Rockefeller's Brothers Foundation to divest from fossil fuels. We went to that event as well, and I mean, tremendous publicity generated by Rockefeller's pulling out of fossil fuels, so that was tremendous. But the big event, of course, was the UN Climate Summit. Very much a personal initiative of Ban Ki-moon, really pushed it. It was his idea to try to generate some political momentum leading up to the meeting in Paris in December 2012, at which the post-2020 targets and strategies will be agreed internationally. We're currently still working to the pre-2020 Kyoto Protocol agreements, and as you know, Copenhagen was such a massive flop in 2009, and the idea was to try and prevent a repeat of Copenhagen. Ban Ki-moon's contribution to that was to organise the climate summit. And there was no intention that there would be a formal statement or a communique out of it. The outcomes of it were simply Ban Ki-moon's own personal summary, which you can read on the web. But it was significant insofar as Tony Abbott wasn't there. That's not significant for the rest of the world. But on that day, there were more government leaders at the UN than any other single day in UN history. Tony Abbott wasn't there, okay? So this was an important event. Just because we ignored it, it's got nothing to do with it. Julie Bishop was there. And if you want to see what came out of the day in terms of people and companies making commitments, then you can go to Ban Ki-moon's summary. Now, but it was very much his personal summary. You know, his staff, I'm sure, helped him do it, but it wasn't a formal UN statement or an adopted position or whatever. But the idea is to move towards the COP meeting in Paris in a year's time. The preceding meeting in Lima will be in, about 2 weeks' time now. And individual countries are being asked, required, to put in their own, not personal, their national proposed targets and strategies by the end of March. And in any other country, we would reasonably be saying, what can we do to influence our government to put in challenging but achievable targets and strategies to make a commitment for COP21 in Paris in a year's time. I have no clue what we do, because you might as well save your breath in many ways. And in fact, the Labour Party haven't got any idea what the government's currently thinking of negotiating. It's so untransparent anyway. But that's the aim, to get towards that. I might finish by just mentioning there was one other event, going back to the divestment issue that I'll mention, which was the launch of the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which is very significant, report on the web. They were looking at, trying to ask the question, can you have economic growth? Put aside the issue of can we have economic growth for a while, and should we, and all the rest of it, but this was a capitalist, the economy and climate. Can we have economic growth and go carbon free? Bearing in mind there's going to be trillions of dollars of investment in infrastructure over the next 30 years. And their very clear conclusion is that investing in capital investments that are low carbon or carbon free will perhaps increase overall the capital investment required by about 5%. Pretty trivial. As soon as you factor in the operating cost savings that you make from having carbon-free investments in the infrastructure, it's far, far cheaper to go with carbon-free investments, low-carbon economy. You can achieve that with cost savings and have economic growth, which is, what G20 and all the rest of them want. How do you do it? No surprise. You have a price on carbon. You stop subsidising fossil fuel industries. You increase your investments in renewables, and these are just some of the things I picked up. And you tackle deforestation. You halt deforestation, and you start to reverse deforestation. And there's some of the major things that emerge in their report. I could say more. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions and so on. Thanks.